you so much. Really happy to be here today. I'm glad to be able to close out the session, which, depending on where you are, may be getting in the way of happy hour today. But hopefully, we'll not let this drag out too far, so that those of you who are closer to the end of your day can enjoy it. And for those of us like myself who are on the West Coast, thanks for joining me during your lunchtime. We appreciate that as well. Today, what I want to talk about really is a kind of a high-level conversation on some observations that I've had here in the industry in my role at Tenable over the last couple of years. Obviously, there's been a lot of changes in the industry, even in the last one, due to the pandemic and all the rest of that. But there's been a pretty significant shift in the way that I see the security industry adapting to all of these changes. And the cloud, in general, has been behind a lot of it. And so what I thought I'd do today is just talk a little bit about those observations. And for those of you who are security leaders trying to help your organizations really make good on some of these changes and adapt to the crazy scope of things that are taking place, offer some advice and some tips, some ways you can start directing your programs, and hopefully we can have some conversations if any of you have questions about it. We'll get into places where we can help and maybe have some bring up some specific suggestions for your use cases. So very quickly, we'll talk about what we're seeing a little bit today, how cloud really has changed kind of everything we've known, and then a little bit into the people, processes, tools, and metrics. I'm a big fan of adding in the measurement category into the old PPT conversation. While we still have a lot of strategy around people, processes, and tools, or people, processes, technology, depending on which frame of reference you come from, I think today you really cannot get away from this without talking about metrics as well. So we'll have a little conversation about that. Obviously, if there's any questions as we go, feel free, and let's just take it from there. So this shouldn't be anything new to anyone, but defense in depth has been our strategy in the security world for a long time. We have had, kind of almost a simplistic approach to how we dealt with monitoring our networks. We manage our servers, our infrastructure, and for a long time this was fine. But let's also keep in mind that this was the world was a little bit different even 10 years ago, let alone 15 or 20. Most organizations had a very static sort of environment. They had a single data center. They had a well-controlled network that they owned, that they built everything on top of. They were able to control all the procurement for every single piece of equipment and software that came into their environment. And so having this notion of sort of a defense in depth strategy, the old castle and moat strategy of rings of defense that we could lay down around our networks and our servers and our databases, it worked. It did work. It was fine. But as the landscape changed, as we saw the birth of the internet, as we saw more and more publicly facing web applications, we saw a lot of changes in how workforces work. People started working remotely or telecommuting. The perimeter was, I think we've all heard at one point in time, the perimeter was dead, right? There really was no more perimeter. And I found, at least in my experiences around that time, was really where the rise of the cloud platforms were starting to take place. Amazon kind of led the way. Of course, we see Microsoft and Google in that space today. But this is where, as we stopped talking about perimeter, we were trying to get kind of our arms around how this was shifting. There was this massive explosion to move these services that we used to have in our self-contained little data centers out to wherever we could get them. But the strategies that we've been using for defense in this way, I will argue today, at least, or in general, but I'll argue today at least, they're not completely dead. We just have to rethink a bit about how we approach this and adapt and change our strategies to account for the fact that we don't control everything anymore, that things are more complex than they ever were in the past. And we do have to look at the world from a slightly different way. But there are still really powerful strategies here. We don't want to throw out all of the things we've learned over the last 20 years. But the traditional notion of having that perimeter defense, having a single point of entry, having a single point of protection, that has to go. And frankly, just by if we look at how the world has worked, it's pretty obvious as to why. If we look at statistically how companies are adapting to cloud in general, how fast this has happened. Surveys are done over the last couple of years, sort of an amalgam of a few surveys that I put together here are found online. But today, we're looking at over 90% of the companies have some sort of cloud presence. 90. This is not just an isolated thing for tech companies. This is just about everyone in some way, shape, or form. About 58% of companies, as of a survey last year, were using some type of hybrid strategy. So they're dealing with multiple environments, a localized data center and AWS, or they're using AWS and Azure, some type of multi-cloud or multi-network strategy to support their infrastructure, support their employees, their businesses. This is not isolated anymore. 5 years ago, I still recall companies telling me that the cloud was really just for techies. It was too specialized. It was too scary. The reality is, in a very short time, many companies have moved to using some type of cloud service. Primarily, as you see from that third item there, what they're really trying to provide is this access to data for both customers and for employees from wherever they are. I think that even before the pandemic set in last year, the need to be able to respond to flexible work environments, to the changing needs of customers, it forced everybody's hand. It was becoming too hard to try to support all of the different use cases for user interaction or employee work from a single data center that you had to manage, all the pieces that came with it. So this notion that we wanted to make sure we provided access to the data, and the data is the key thing here, I think really started to drive, whether companies wanted to do it or not, whether leadership was prepared or not, really drove the need to move to something that allowed for an easier way to manage that kind of access from wherever on the globe people were trying to access it from. So it's a significant shift. I mean, I think those of us who are in technology or in security, we've seen this coming. This isn't new for us, but the business leaders we're working with, you're still going to run into people out there who think that it's too specialized, it's not secure or safe enough, it's too scary, it's can't be supported, whatever it is. And frankly, even if we're having a hard time convincing them for the benefits of doing it, the fact that everyone else is doing it should be enough for most business leaders to understand that this is not an unusual scenario. This is now has become the norm. And if this new model has become the norm, we really can't keep doing the same thing. Now, this transition's been going on for some time, but then last March came along. The timing, of course, for today's event is pretty good. In fact, for 1 year ago today, I believe, for where I live, was when we officially went into lockdown. So happy anniversary to those of you who are in the same neck of the woods that I was. But COVID changed everything in this regard. The conversations that I've heard in the last year with CISOs and CIOs worldwide has made it very, very clear that if there was hesitation before, that hesitation ended really, really fast, whether they liked it or not. One particular survey that I really thought was very telling was this Gallup poll, the upper left corner here. They did a survey last year. Within about 3 weeks, they found that the number of remote workers in the United States went from 31% to 62%. We doubled the amount of people working from home within 3 weeks of going on lockdown, roughly speaking. This is after we've spent years hearing from business leaders, it can't be done. Telecommuting is not possible. Working from home isn't possible. We can't support our businesses from if all of our workers aren't in an office building. We can't support things in the cloud. This is rhetoric we've heard for a long time, but COVID forced the issue, frankly. And we see that in how these these various statistics were done, these surveys that have been done over the last year. There's many, many more. It came fast, and people had to do it from just a business continuity standpoint. You had to do it. So we did. What was interesting about this, though, at least for me personally, was that a lot of folks had plans to deal with some sort of emergency. They did not plan for this. Most of them did not have a scenario set up for a pandemic situation. And the logistics involved in a pandemic situation are very different, as we've all come to learn. Most emergency plans that I've seen, they typically deal with natural disasters, right? Earthquakes, hurricanes, tornadoes, blizzards. They are things that are very dramatic, very fast, but then often, within a short amount of time kind of fade and go away and you can recover. But here we are in a situation where a year later, we're still fighting with these problems. And cloud has been the answer for a lot of companies to maintain their existence, frankly. I think a number of companies, if they had not forced that transition, if their IT teams had not made the leap as quickly as they did, we would see a lot more companies being out of business right now if they hadn't done it. So this has changed everything, right? And again, whether people prepared for it or not, whether they had a transition plan or not, if they had their 18-month, 2-year plan, the fact of the matter is, it's gotten done for a lot of companies. And so here we are, a year after the pandemic. We've got these massive implementations now that have been done, a lot of transitioning, and we're in the moment where maybe we can take a breath. Maybe we can start to think about what we're doing. And this is the moment to, if you haven't already rethought your strategy for securing all of this and all of these new services in place, this is the time to sit back now and rethink that. Now, before I go any further, I've seen there's a few questions coming in. Maybe we can answer a couple of those right now before I continue on.
Yeah, go for it. So there's a few comments coming in here. Did change? Cloud. We have some in our security group who won't condone cloud, and business leaders resistant to require it based on fear of the finger pointing at them if there was a breach. Any suggestions?
Well, so this is one of those places where the defense in depth strategy kind of still applies, right? Kind of a nice lead in here to this existing thing. There is a myth out there, kind of on two sides. One is that cloud environments work exactly the same as my on-prem network. So I could just very easily pick up whatever I was doing and apply the same thing out in the cloud. And that's just not true, right? There is additional levels of complexity. There are new types of services and applications. We're dealing with virtualization services, container services, new ways of managing access rights and permissions and things. It's new. There are more complexities involved. There's a lot of benefits to doing that as well. But there is some additional complexity. And I've seen organizations use that argument to back up some of their concerns around, but now the cloud, it's all out there, right? So they're concerned about data. They're trying to frame an argument around security where to back up their hesitation for going to the service. I would tell you that there are definitely different considerations to be made from a security standpoint, no question about that. But it really isn't that much different from a security standpoint in terms of the considerations that you have data, you have assets, you're going to have to put in controls to mitigate risk to those assets in that data set, just the same as you would have to do that consideration if you were managing your on-prem network. The difference is you have new tools, you have the benefits that cloud provides in terms of my little trio here on this very slide. In terms of flexibility and scaling, it is often much easier to roll out controls or to put new security tools in place because you can scale them out in a pretty fast way. There's some amount of training perhaps and some new skills that your teams need to develop, but frankly, that should have been happening already. This is where the world is. And so if the concern is around, we don't know how to manage it, that's an important consideration that organizations need to look at, and one where we should be solving that already. But that's a training and education issue. In terms of that concern, though, around the data sets, I mean, cloud implementations can be every bit as secure as an on-premise implementation of anything. It really just depends on how well your controls are, what your program's like, do you have proper review, are your policies strong? All of the same kind of security controls that we've been doing for years, the concepts. We just have to look at them from the new, take into account the new complexities and the new tool sets that we have to deal with from a cloud perspective. So, you know, some folks I think on the business side are never going to be going to buy in, and that is difficult. I feel for you there, but they really don't have much of an argument. The idea that data is less safe out there than not is not a testament to cloud. It's a testament to how we implement cloud and how we secure what we're doing out there. And that's a knowledge thing that we have to learn on our side, and that could definitely be a concern. But you know, this is where as security leaders we need to make sure our teams are well trained, we have the right skill set, we have the right tools, we have the right processes, just like we've done before when any other shift in technologies happened.
Right.
So a little long-winded, but hopefully that helped a little
No,
bit.
that's great, Nathan. The other questions in right now I think are best saved as we get to Q&A at the end, so feel free to dive back in.
Fair enough. I use that for my coffee break there very quickly. So I think a part of this conversation then about this is that we have some notions about cloud, and we have to kind of move past some of this. And I think this is where we get held up a bit. I've talked to some folks this year, and it's funny how some of this has already changed. I still hear a little bit, but I think with the underlying principle of a lot of the myths that I hear about, the first three are kind of the same, which is really just people believe it's not different, and it is. So we do need to take a more mindful approach. We do have to understand that even just by the nature of these networks being able to scale, that they can operate at a speed much, much different than we've seen in the past. And I don't necessarily mean by the processing speed, but think about the amount of time it takes to provision a new server. In many environments in a traditional network, I've seen large organizations fight with the notion of trying to get a server spun up because it would take 2 to 3 months to get it procured, another month to get the hardware delivered, another month to get somebody from the operations team to rack the server, another month to get the software built and the image deployed, another month to get the networking done. By the time that the server actually got up and running and they were able to start building their application or whatnot, they already needed more services, they needed new servers, or it was obsolete. It kind of was sort of the nature of things for a long time. But in the cloud environment, quite frankly, if I have a credit card, I can spin up a whole environment in minutes. I can have servers up and running in minutes. I can be out there doing something immediately. And certainly many companies are struggling with that very problem where they have development teams who spin up test beds or Q&A environments to try and do application testing or development, because it's so easy and so fast. I don't have to wait on anyone anymore. I could just get it done. So the power for what we have in the cloud is really, really beneficial to all organizations, but we cannot approach it the same way. This idea that it's all the same, it just can't be done that way. The last myth I want to mention too, for those of you who may see this from your business leaders as well, be really mindful if you're still struggling with folks who think that they don't have to do any security work at all, that these massive companies like Amazon and Microsoft and Google know how to do security better than the rest of us and that they're taking it all on. They're not. Read your contracts, be very clear about the user agreements. There is only so far that they will authorize managing the security of their platforms. The rest of it's all up to you. So taking the same approach is going to be really bad. If you've moved to the cloud thinking you can take no approach, that's even worse. The reality is we have to make some movement forward and address this from all the levels, people, process, tools, to make sure that we are accounting for all this change and all the benefit. Simply put, and I just use this as kind of a highlight slide, this has been part of what cloud has brought to the table, right? the types of assets that we're dealing with, the types of things we're trying to manage has also expanded at the same time that this network infrastructure has expanded. So we're no longer dealing with simply servers and workstations and network infrastructure equipment. We all now are fighting with web applications, virtualized environments, containers, mobile devices, laptops, in many worlds, OT devices. We see tons more operational technology outside of even just the manufacturing and the power sort of companies. Many companies are bringing on operational technology environments. That's been a big shift, and networking them, which is also a big shift. So the types of assets we're dealing with and trying to secure has expanded. The number of them expands because it's so much easier now to spin some of these things up. So from a scale kind of perspective, it was one thing when we could control the environment and control what went into it. Now, everything scales up so quickly and so fast, the same tactics really are going to be ineffective when we're trying to apply them across many different types of networks, many different types of assets, where the techniques and the tools that we're going to use to deal with them is going to be different. So keep all of this in mind. It's a much bigger problem than it's ever been before. If you're feeling overwhelmed, you are right to feel overwhelmed. It's a real problem. And again, this is where, from a program standpoint, it's so imperative that we make the change. So, kind of recapping what I just mentioned, for all of these reasons, cloud has kind of changed it all, right? We can take some of the strategies that we've seen for the old defense in depth approach, but we really have to scale this out in a way that we can address the speed of how these things move, the scale of how quickly they can get out of control, and we have to make sure these controls don't kill off the flexibility that a lot of these cloud environments provide, because that's one of the big benefits that we're seeing for doing this kind of rolling out. So we want to keep the good from what we've done for the last 20 plus years, but we need to evolve a little bit from what we've done before. So let's talk about for each of the techniques, the people process tools. Let's talk a little bit about what that looks like. So I'll start with tools because I think it's probably the most simple and direct thing, and I would almost argue that this is probably the one that most everybody kind of knows, but I want to make sure that I highlight a couple of pieces to this. When we had a simple controlled data center type architecture, it was easy back in the day to have, sort of generalized tools that sort of did everything we needed. That really isn't the case anymore. The disparity in the types of assets really do require that we have specialized security controls in place. Now, for some things, you can broaden this. I would argue that things like credential management typically is centralized in some ways, whether that's your Active Directory or you've got some of the directory service out there. We can kind of manage them through singular special tools or specified tools. But if you say, like, from the Tenable side of things, we're obviously we do vulnerability management as our main focus. We're trying to identify vulnerabilities on all these different assets to help people prioritize where they should remediate. The days of just having a scanner appliance are over. If you look at just our portfolio today of the number of types of scanner or sensors that we use to grab data from all these different assets, I think we have 7 or 8 different ones today. And part of that is to help accommodate for the different architectures, the different ways that organizations manage and maintain their assets. We have to be flexible enough to accommodate the right solution for the right thing. So finding tools that are flexible, that give you a lot of options, are now, I would consider, a mandatory thing. Years past, some people frowned upon that notion. Today, you've got to have more tools in the toolbox. Look for tools that really leverage APIs. APIs are the backbone of it all today. If you're managing a cloud environment, that's what you're using. Your tools should be using them too, period. I still come across security tools today that want to not integrate into cloud platforms or into cloud software services. The only way that we're going to stay ahead of that is if we can leverage automation and we can talk to these systems in a programmatic sort of way. APIs are really the key to a lot of that. So make sure that you're driving with any of your vendors or anyone you're buying your tools for, make sure you're driving that they have deep API availability for their tool and that they will talk and integrate with the APIs for other things. This environment moves way too fast. You cannot rely on humans to keep up with the changes. You're going to have to make sure that you can programmatically respond to security events, to incidents, to rolling out new changes, to making whatever you have to do from a security controls perspective. This form of automation is going to be critical to making that happen in these environments. Yeah, I mean, really, that's going to be the key. We're trying to keep up with a speed problem here to some extent. Manually deploying things just isn't going to cut it anymore. So keep that in mind when you're looking at tools. Get plenty of tools in the toolbox. Use the right tool for the right job, and make sure that it's talking to these environments in a way that it can be automated as much as possible. Really quickly, I know we have a few minutes here. Any questions about the tools part that is coming up? Jason, have we seen any? Let's see if there's any here.
Some questions, comments, but again, I think all good to save until you've finished off this piece actually. But some great questions and comments coming in. So please keep them coming, folks.
Okay. So let's talk about process. Process is, I think, arguably is one of the harder parts to deal with. Only because organizations typically lean towards maintaining the status quo. So when we're dealing with process and procedures for cloud environments or adopting cloud environments, again, this is a really good time to rethink it. We're a year in. Many folks have made changes when they weren't ready to. Our operation teams have done a really good job of keeping us up and running, but now is the time to rethink the future. Where I see the biggest benefits when we're talking about reviewing policies or we're talking about how we adapt our processes to better reflect what's going on, I think we have to take our cues from the same benefits that the cloud systems provide. Our policies and our processes, our approach to this also has to be more dynamic. We have to move more quickly. There are times, well, in a previous life when I've done management consulting, I always love to ask the question of when was the last time you reviewed your policies? If I got an answer that was less than 3 years, that was pretty impressive and rare. We can't be doing that anymore. The world changes too fast. What our customers demand of us changes too fast. Our employees' needs change too fast. The way we manage data changes all the time. So as much as we have been taught for years that policy has to be this set in stone kind of thing that we should never change, I think what we're seeing now is much more of taking an agile development approach to how we look at processes and policies as well. So start to build in quicker review cycles. Ask yourselves the question, is this policy still working? Does it still serve us? Does it serve the business? Is it actually bringing some kind of benefit, or are we just putting rules down on paper that no one's really following anyway? And if no one's following them, we need to change this immediately. I also recommend rethinking a little bit about how you set milestones for making those changes. Historically, what I've seen happen is many times those policy reviews are just based on time. We'll do it once a year, whether we need it or not. Or we'll do it after a data breach happens. Of course, by then it's too late, but now we'll review our policies because we should have been. I make a very strong argument with all of my customers that you have to throw that out the window, right? Information security as it stands today, we are not really in the business of technology anymore. We are a risk management function of an organization. Certainly, we use technology. It's core and critical to our expertise and imperative that we understand the tools and technologies we're working with. But what used to be an offshoot of the IT department 20 years ago, we are really not there anymore. We are a proper risk management function in most organizations. So we should be measuring and changing our policies and adjusting things based on not just the technical risk that we see in the environments, but what the business considers to be at risk and how we can incorporate those two things together to make better decisions on how our policies should support that, how our policies can help us mitigate some of those concerns, both technical and business, and then build processes around that that make sense for those functions. This is a much bigger focus on business than it ever has been before. And as so much of the cloud adoption recently has been about business continuity, I think it's fair to use that as a security leader to say, I want to change how we do these things with our policies and process to better support the business. I really leverage that as part of your case to get some buy-in from the business leaders, ideally from the IT folks too. But we really need to change the conversation about how we look at our processes and how we look at policy. It starts with risk rather than anything else. And we need to start doing it faster. I mean, bluntly put. So a few other things up here. I won't go through all of it, but obviously you've had a moment to read it. But that's where you should be focusing for your process changes from how we've looked at this in the past. Okay. From a people standpoint, I've mentioned this already a little bit. Training is really so important. I hear this a lot from people, right? I have a staff, I support my staff, they don't know how to use the cloud stuff. You've got to train them. Your environments are heading that way, the technologies are shifting. We have to make sure our staff is empowered properly to understand what they're going to support, to understand how to manage it, and how to, how to take it forward. If that means you've got to get outside help, I'm fine with that. I would remind all of you, though, to when you're thinking about outside help, I don't just mean consultants. Look at your existing vendors. I'll pony up Tenable myself. Since I work for one, but we have a core part of our company philosophy is really how much we want to help our customers do more with what they have, and so we have a vested interest in making sure that our customers succeed and that they're protecting their environments and that they're doing more. So ask your vendors. A lot of times, there's plenty of free resources that your vendors will provide. Experts in certain fields that they have on staff that they may come in. Sometimes you can even get that for free. So you have some resources available to you if you need outside help, but train, educate, get that help when you need it. We have to start building a skill set around these environments if we're going to better manage them and not feel like it's this foreign world out there that's just Wild West and we don't know what to do and it's too scary to manage. The more we understand it, less scary it is. I also want to highlight when it comes to the people, communication is arguably one of the most critical parts of this puzzle. One of my mentors back in the day, his favorite saying was, you have to tell people 17 times, 17 different ways. And I have really come to adopt that in my own strategies as well. From security side of life, we live in a very different world than most everyone else in our organizations lives, which also means we communicate differently than they do. So we do need to broaden the scope of how we communicate, make sure more people understand where risk is in the environment, why we're making these changes, what needs to happen to do it correctly. But while we're broadening, we also need to transform that message and speak it in a way that's relevant to each of those target audiences. So one of the big reasons why I harp on that notion that information security is really a risk management discipline. If you can speak about what we do from a risk management standpoint, suddenly your finance team is going to understand you a whole lot better because they're a risk management function. If you talk to legal counsel, lawyers may not understand the technology, but they understand risk. And they're going to better understand what you're talking about. Business leaders, salespeople, HR, like all of these organizations, they may not understand the tech. They may not understand what we do hands-on every single day. But if we can frame those conversations in ways that are relevant to them from a risk perspective, suddenly we've created some common ground that makes a whole lot of difference. So yes, broaden your communication, but it really is up to us to change the message, how we do it, so that it's relevant to people, and we start to get better buy-in and understanding from all of our business organizations to adopt into these new changes, to adapt to what cloud brings, and to make sure that these new practices, don't just get tossed to the wayside, they're actually effective. All right, last bit. Talking about metrics from a security standpoint. So metrics is, again, really important, and you do have to help your business leaders understand why what we're seeing out in the world is not what they expect. Some of this, I think we all know, right? There's no winning, essentially. We're never going to reach zero of anything. No, we're not going to hit zero vulnerabilities. We're never going to hit zero data breaches. We're never going to hit zero pieces of malware or ransomware. We are risk management, not risk elimination. We minimize as much as we can, but we're never going to get to zero. Helping people understand that that's the case and that it's okay that that's the case is a really, really important part of the business conversation. Business leaders don't necessarily get it, right? If you think about like a salesperson, either they close a deal or they don't. There's a lot of other pieces of an organization that can be binary. Security isn't often one of them. So as part of your communication effort, help people understand why it's a zero-sum game. Whether that's because the world changes so fast, you can use this last year or two of the pandemic time to highlight that. Attackers change their tactics, what they're after changes, our business processing. We're in a state of constant change. It's never going to be absolute. But educate people about that, make sure that's front and center when you're talking about your metrics. When we can do that, then trending becomes a much better tool for identifying whether or not we're being successful in our programs, right? There's a much different conversation to be had if you can tell an organization or your business leaders, we've managed to reduce 35% of our critical risks in the organization over the last 2 months, versus saying we remediated 55,000 vulnerabilities. Is 55,000 good? Is it bad? Are they the right vulnerabilities? Do we know? Nobody knows. They don't have a concept of that. So talking about things from a trending perspective, I always find to be more successful in this approach, as we're trying to be more dynamic. We're trying to account for all this change that cloud has brought. Trends let us see better over time what's been happening, rather than trying to do absolute figures, which, frankly, is almost impossible to do with the way that these environments are so nebulous. And lastly, bring up that middle point. If you can tie what you're doing from a technical perspective to the business risk, you will win this game. Cloud adoption for a lot of companies has been a business decision. In some cases, business survival. So if you can start to talk about your security program, the way you do your policies, the way you implement controls, the way that you manage credentials, the way you do vulnerability assessment, whatever it is, if you could talk about it from the benefit it brings the business, if you can make it make sense from that business perspective, you're going to get a whole lot more buy-in. Your metrics are going to make more sense to these people, and they're going to see the value that security brings to the table, rather than security just being this cost that they don't really understand why they have to do, other than it keeps them out of the news, right? So this is a good place to rethink how we've looked at reporting metrics in the past. It's a little bit less about the technical pieces of how many assets we've managed or how many vulnerabilities we've fixed, and more about how we've reduced cost, how we have mitigated risk factors. And there's obviously a lot of strategies around this, but we need to start adopting that as part and parcel of how we do it, rather than just relying on the output of volumetric sort of numbers. Okay. Gone on almost a time here, so I'll sum it up here again with this. Like, these changes are not going away. Just like the pandemic, some people thought a year ago this was going to be done in a few weeks. We're still dealing with it a year later. Cloud adoption, likewise, is not going away. So we need to make sure that the policies and procedures we're putting in place, the way we implement our security programs, has to adapt to the times. We can use defense in depth techniques, but those strategies have to broaden to account for the scale and scope and flexibility the cloud provides. We want to be dynamic about this. We should be risk focused, and that's both business and technical risk, not just the technical. I'll close with one last point there. Don't be afraid to keep relying on the standards. Those things are still good resources, even though the environments have changed, the scope has changed. We just have to adapt, right? There's awesome techniques still buried in even some of the older ISO 27000 series stuff, but we may have to adopt our tools or our processes better to take advantage of those frameworks to make sure that we're doing proper security, or that we're bringing some security benefit to these new hybrid environments or multi-cloud environments. So don't give up on those things either. Don't give up on defense in depth, but this is the time to adapt in ways that we probably haven't done in the last arguably 15 or 20 years. All right, I've gone up to, I think, just about time. Questions,
Fantastic.
thoughts, other things?
Yeah, let's dive in. Well, first and foremost, thank you very, very much, Nathan. Really appreciate that. And we do have it's been amazing comments and chatter going on in the chat box here. We do have some questions coming in, so let's just dive right in. So the first question is, most of the large enterprise level companies will end up with a multi-cloud or hybrid infrastructure. So with that said, how does Tenable plan to approach that reality, and does it have a proposed approach for such companies to adopt?
Well, so from Tenable's standpoint, we have a very specific kind of approach, right? We're a vulnerability management company. We're very focused on how we address managing vulnerabilities, but managing vulnerabilities from our perspective is a risk exercise, right? The days of this simply being run a scanner appliance, scan a server, get a bunch of information back, and then send that out as a report, that's kind of over. Now we've really changed how vulnerability management is used as a decision-making tool. And it really requires a couple of things. Our approach means that we have to expand the way we assess assets. So we've introduced a number of different tools to try to accommodate for how these environments have changed. Web application scanning, OT assessments, container assessment. Like, we have to have the right tools to assess all these new assets that, or enterprises that are going to move into the cloud or have multi-cloud strategies are going to deal with. We expand our API usages. We have partnerships with all of the major platforms like Amazon and Microsoft, where we can directly connect into their frameworks now, or through APIs, and just assess information directly from them without having to do scans or agents or all the rest. So there's a lot of fundamental changes in the technology piece that we're doing to help keep up with that. The other side of it is the decision-making piece, which for our purposes, we focus a lot on prioritization of risk, right? So if you were to look at our tool set and answer the question, like, how are we helping organizations deal with these multi-cloud strategies, you're going to end up with way more assets than you've ever had before. You're going to end up with more vulnerabilities than you've ever had before. I don't think it's reasonable anymore for us to think that we're going to fix every vulnerability in our environment. So part of what we've been doing is incorporating a lot of different threat intelligence feeds, including some of our own research that we do, compiling all of this vast amounts of data about what's going on with threats in the real world, applying that to the vulnerabilities, and then being able to prioritize it in a simple way to say, hey, this might be a CVSS score 10 vulnerability, but it's not your priority today because this other one that's a 9, there's live exploits happening on the world today. We're seeing live activity, and it's in your area, your neck of the woods, and we know some of your assets are vulnerable to it. You should start your prioritization there if you're trying to make the decision today. So we're moving away from just a simple technical tool that, like Nessus was 20 years ago to scan networks. And we're moving into this place where we're really taking a risk-based approach to help make decisions around fixing these problems. So it's there's a lot more to it, but in taking 60 seconds to try to explain our approach, I mean, that's the simple two-part piece of it.
Thank you very much. According to Gartner, through 2022, at least 95% of cloud security failures will be the customer's fault. Would like to hear your perspective.
Yes. I mean, I think part of what Gartner's saying here, and I know those, kind of a tongue-in-cheek response. I apologize whoever asked that.
Of course.
But no, I mean, I think, again, that misconception that if I move to the cloud, I'm automatically secured because Amazon knows what they're doing, or Microsoft secures it. I don't have to do anything. We are becoming, in some cases, our own worst enemy about securing this stuff. And excuses don't matter to attackers, right? I mean, that's kind of the flip side of this. I have done consulting with C-level executives who have said, well, I shouldn't have to secure these things. Well, why? Well, because it's on someone else's network. They should be doing it for me. Yeah, it's all your assets. It's your data. It's your intellectual property. Like, you absolutely have a requirement to do that. So we have a cultural change that needs to happen. And until it does, I think we're going to have a lot of organizations that are going to have failures to protect their environments, which, you know, attackers are going to take advantage of. So I don't think it's an unreasonable kind of stance. I think we can change it. I mean, I think Gartner's kind of talking about trending, right? What we're going to see going in the future. But I think if we can get on top of this now and adopt a more dynamic posture around how we're doing this, we can change that 95% number. But you know, it is a change in approach about how we do this, and that's what we're talking about today.
Actually, you had a great analogy once on this. It's like a parking lot, right? You drive your car into your parking lot. You don't leave your car unlocked just because the parking lot allows you to park it there. You've got to lock your car as well. It's not their fault if somebody then opens the door, right?
Absolutely.
Which I really love. I love those kind of like real world scenarios. So thank you very, very much. Peter Coas, by going to the cloud, you are outsourcing your security to the cloud vendor. So how would you look at negotiating with those providers to ensure that security is in place and effective? Some big providers, as you mentioned, Microsoft, Amazon, just have boilerplate that applies to all customers, which might not be the right fit for your organization. Is it prudent to assume that cloud providers will only do the minimum and that their security is just basic, and treat all connections to be unsecured and need to be authenticated and authorized? If so, how would you make it easy to facilitate good customer experience? A lot to unwrap there.
Yeah, Peter, you should hire me as a consultant. We could spend months sitting down having this conversation. I think the simple answer: do not expect anything from the vendors. Period. Their legal team is better than your legal team. Their boilerplate is boilerplate for a reason, and they have drawn very, very hard lines in the sand about what they are going to take care of and what they're not going to take care of. The idea that you are outsourcing your security to them by going to the cloud is totally false. You have no security when you go out to the cloud. It's just like any other network from that stance. If you spin up a network in your own environment, there is no security on it until you put it in place. So I would always recommend, if you're going to move into a cloud environment, look, the part that they own, they will take very good care of. I have actually worked with both the Amazon, like the AWS teams and the Azure teams. I know what they're doing under the hood. They're exceptional at maintaining their own stuff. But that stuff does not apply to what you put out there at all. So have a plan, expect to start from scratch, make sure that you're taking into account, you've already hinted at it, authentication methodologies, who has access, make sure who's authorized, do your patching. You've got to have a plan for all that in place, and you cannot expect that they're going to provide any of it. I also would suggest not trying to fight them on their boilerplate. I have seen that exercise go down from some very large companies, and the stance historically has been, So I don't think you're going to get a lot of play from the big, Microsoft, Google, Amazon sort of folks if you want to make some changes there. It's far better for you to just take an approach of like, it's a great network, it will scale, it's going to provide me all this benefit, but I'm going to have to put in all the security controls I need for my data and my assets without relying on them to do it. That's your best approach.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Really appreciate that. And thank you very much for the question, Peter. And he acknowledges that as well. Thank you. Another question here. Is it a good idea to combine vulnerability scan with patching?
So, yeah, I hear this come up every now and then. I find, so this is my personal opinion for what it's worth. I've been in the business now almost 25 years, and the bulk of my career I've spent in the vulnerability management world. So just for what it's worth, in one way, shape, or form. My standpoint is vulnerability assessment tools, vulnerability scanning tools, were always meant to be sort of this independent third-party auditor, but in an automated fashion. And for me, I want to be able to use my vulnerability assessment tools as a validation mechanism that whatever remediation work I'm doing is actually working. I recognize people want like a big easy button for this stuff, right? Like I just want to hit one button and I want my tool to go out and scan it, identify all the patches, just deploy the patches, reboot my system for me automatically, update all my tickets, and you want to have it all done easy. And I understand that, and there are actually ways to do it. But I would rather have multiple systems that are specially designed for the right thing. Like I want a patch management tool that does patch management. And I don't mind, I want an API integration back to my vulnerability assessment tool where I can have the patch management tool say, okay, I've done my work. I think we're good. From my patch management perspective, I think we've done all the right things. I want my tool then to be able to validate that actually happened. And I mean, look, even in just the Microsoft world, we've all seen this, right? We get a new patch out, someone deploys it, doesn't reboot the box. Is that patch really implemented? No. They deploy the patch, they reboot the box, but they forget to make the registry change that needs to happen in the Windows environment to take that effect. Is that really patched? I would say no, because it's still vulnerable, right? So separating the functionality, in my opinion, of having your whatever assessment tools you're using be heavily integrated. I love having that all in the workflow, but having them be separated out from the patch management functionality, you prevent that fox guarding the hen house scenario. And I have a much better level of reliability that if I reassess something and it still comes back vulnerable, then some other part of my process is broken down and I need to go fix that part. So I would rather see those separated out rather than to see my vulnerability tool say, yeah, no, it's good, trust me. I also did the work, by the way, but don't test me on that, right? I want to have validation.
Good stuff. We've got 2 more questions and we don't have a session straight after this, so I'll take up to the top of the hour here, folks. So first one is, well, I suppose a bit of a follow-on from what we were just talking about, but are the vulnerability tools actually merging with automated penetration testing tools? Do we still need both?
We do. So I think the way I look at it, and I will say I come from a little bit of a pen testing background, so I've done consulting this world and sat there with the toolbox. What I like about the approach for this is that if we can automate the vulnerability assessment piece up front, then I can at least get the heavy lift out of the way. For most penetration, pen testing folks, if you're missing a bunch of Microsoft patches on a system I'm going to test, we already you shouldn't even have me on site. Like you're not ready for me to pen test at that point if you haven't patched for the last 3 or 4 years. Like this is just not even worthwhile. You're wasting your money. So I think it's a good tool to do that kind of lay of the land baselining. Let's understand what I'm looking at and see if there's any obvious red flags. Then feeding some of that information into a proper pen testing tool where I can do more custom work. Right, I can start to fuzz my responses. I can start to write my own little attack scripts. I can, I can use the information that the vulnerability assessment tools give me, the metadata and everything else assessed already, and I can start to hone in where I'm going to focus my pen testing efforts. So, as a pen tester, I find that makes me a little more effective, especially if I'm doing it as a consultant. I'm billing a customer. I want to, be efficient with my time. I can automate the boring stuff with the vulnerability assessment tool. And then I can focus my expertise on the harder pieces where it matters, rather than trying to do it all from guesswork from the pen testing tool. And it obviously depends if we're talking web applications or actual network breaking in and breaking and entering kind of thing. So, but I like both tools in the toolbox. Frankly, I just like to use them for kind of 2 steps of the process.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm going to squeeze one final question in before I close things off. How do you challenge siloed organizations that don't think opening API access to tools internally for security is a good thing?
Wow. Should hire a consultant to come in and talk about that too. No. This is a real problem. I see this happening all the time, and I think this is another one of those sort of cultural problems that we have to get past. This is more of a people issue than anything else. I think APIs, even a handful of years ago, were kind of considered this, insecure way of issuing system commands, and we have to be really guarded about them. And that's still somewhat true. We do have to be guarded about them because there's a lot of power in an API, right? We can automate processes and things and spiral out of control if we've made mistakes. But security around APIs has gotten a lot better. Because they're being used so much more often, there's a lot of ways to control access. There's ways to control the requests back and forth. The rise of privileged access management tools, I think, has been a very compelling use case for securing API connectivity. So, if you're dealing with an organization that's really siloed like that and they don't want to connect, they're trying to claim security, I think you have to figure out what their argument is, because it's probably not a valid argument. Actually, they think it's valid. It's what they're using. If the question is, well, it can't be secured because of credentials, let's talk tools. Like we can implement tools that can secure these transmissions and solve that problem. Now what? Oh, well, I guess if it's credentials are secured, then I guess it's okay, right? But from a business perspective, there's also an argument to be had there that we simply have to move at the speed of business today. Sorry to sound cliche, but that's the truth of it. And when we're dealing with cloud environments, when we're dealing with the way the world is moving to these big scaling hybrid environments, massive, virtualized systems, whatnot, we can't keep running data back and forth manually. We can't wait overnight for, SQL backups to be shipped over to another network and then spun back up on another server. It's just not real anymore. So if there's a security consideration, we can solve that usually from a process or a tool standpoint. If it's not really a security consideration, it's just an obstacle situation, then we need to focus on the benefit to the business to help change their culture on how they see these things. It's not an easy process. I feel for you in that one, but you kind of have to take each step approach, like get rid of the excuse, but also remind them that, this is the world. This is how we have to function if we're going to support the business. We just got to find the right way to do it securely.
Fantastic. Well, that's a great way to not only close out this session, but also close out day one. So thank you very much, Nathan. And again, if all attendees can just join me in a virtual round of applause, Nathan, that'd be greatly appreciated. Thank you very, very much, sir.